All right. Now we're streaming on YouTube. Well, YouTube's like a 30-second lag, but it'll be there. Sweet. Awesome. Yeah, if you're new to logging in here, we'll get started in a minute or two. But just say where you're from, what you're hoping to learn today. We'd love to get to know you. Awesome. Cool. Minnesota, Washington, Columbia. All right. I think Bill, you can probably get started. I don't think we need to wait too much longer. I mean, I can intro and explain what this is, or you can go ahead and do that. Whatever you feel like would be more natural.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me, well, first of all, yeah, thank you everyone for jumping on and joining our, let me see, is this the second or third Wisconsin UX live stream that we've done, quarantine live stream. We try to stream all of our talks and presentations, even when we were back in the office. Wisconsin UX is a group of product designers, product managers, and just people interested in design, and even some developers who work on like front end stuff that kind of get together once a month and talk on various design topics, and really anything we can think about to really drive sort of UX. We've done things on like user research. We've done things on like properly doing user mapping, product mapping, and really just kind of all kinds of interesting things. If anyone on here is interested in ever giving a talk on Wisconsin UX, let us know. We are definitely looking for other people to contribute and hopefully continue to build the community and just kind of share some knowledge. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, cool. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is it coming through okay, Jacob?
Yes.
All right, awesome. All right, so this talk was originally a much longer talk, creating, iterating, and maintaining scalable design systems. Design system is really one of my favorite topics to talk about and just be a part of. I really like designing, working in these big sort of larger systems and even some of these smaller ones. You know, like the really fun stuff. I like talking like about naming conventions, organizing things, having the meetings about organizing the things, working closely with developers. I think as designers, a lot of this stuff sometimes gets a bad rap. We just want to kind of like push some pixels, let our creative juices flow, interview users, iterate on things, and do some research. And sometimes these smaller nuanced things that help us manage our work and manage our systems and create well-organized systems falls through the cracks. And I think it's really critical with our ever-connected tool set and the demands that are put on us now with the new design live tools like Figma and Adobe XD. This is really changing for us. So today we're going to focus on the creation aspect. Like I said, this is going to be part of a multi-part series. The second part will be about iterating and maintaining that, but we're going to focus on a lot of tips and tricks around creating your design system. And like I said, maintaining and iterating will either be combined next month or the month thereafter. We'll break up maintaining and iterating into 2 talks. A little bit about myself. My name is Billy Sweetman. I'm a husband, dad of 2, design lead at Headway. I've been doing design work for roughly about 12 years. Used to work in the game industry, doing really design system work, just they were called modular level systems and not really modular design systems. I've built systems in the product space for the better part of 9 years. At Headway, I've had a chance to work on small startup apps and large enterprise apps, and really wanted to distill like our process and sort of our planning and kind of some of the inspirations and things that have helped us build our process out. It's kind of a little bit overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to kind of talk about where to start, setting up our team, deciding what to build and what not to build, organization in our tools, and documentation resources. So what are design systems? This can be a really overloaded term. They're more than just our UI kit or some coded components. Design systems are collected building blocks and patterns and sort of knowledge that helps us build consistent and cohesive apps. With the push for better design and better user experiences that scale with the products that we build, there was this natural evolution from where brand books kind of started, or these guides are created by branding agencies and creatives to help manage their brand systems. This is a really good example of a NASA one. This natural, what we would think of design systems naturally sort of evolved out of these. But they have a little hint of development in there. This is something that the development world has been talking and doing for a long time, since roughly the late 60s. Component-based development was originally presented by Douglas McLaury as a way to build reusable code, and we're sort of living in a very similar state in our design tools, building reusable design elements. So first, we're going to dive into the creation of our system. We're going to decide what to build out in a system. We've gotten the approvals. We're ready to go. How do we know when we need a system? How complicated should it be? What should our team structure be like? And we're going to kind of go over all of this. There are a few things to factor when starting off with your design system: budget, project scope, and timelines. While I'm a firm believer a system can really fit into every project size, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the answer for everyone. Sometimes smaller projects, it just doesn't make sense to spin one up or maybe use something that's already been built. With starting with a new product, our options are really open for how we want to tackle this and building out our system. So a lot of this is going to be focused around a new product, but it can be easily be applied to an existing product. If we do an existing product, though, we want to tackle a UX audit first. This UX audit will give us a comprehensive list of patterns and components and maybe code that's already been built and developed out that we can then use and help us inform the next stages in our design system creation. So now we've decided to build our system, or we've completed our UX audit, and we're able to start planning our system. What does our team look like? What's important, or what is our team value in creating our system? How do we go about setting up our files? What's sort of the naming convention that we want to use? What buy-in do we need to have from the development team? Are we even working with the development team at this point in the stage? We'll be looking at each one of these questions as we work through the planning process. So finding out what our team values. One of the first things we can do is find out what's really important to our team. Oops. A good exercise to do is gather the stakeholders from around the team and from different departments, gathering sales, development, marketing, and design, and working through what everyone thinks is the most important elements to start to build in a reusable way, and things that can be left a little bit open or a little bit less structured. Creating a checklist of your design system with everyone and the items that they find valuable can be really helpful. You can even use this team to start to delegate different people in different departments on what might be important to them. Marketing may have a smaller bit in the design system that they might be using that they are then in charge of instead of maybe the product design team. One tool to use is called Design System Checklist. Now, this is a comprehensive design system tool. It allows you to manage and review sort of an entire fully spec'd out design system. However, when you're finding out what your team values, you can take elements from this. You don't have to use this full list here, but it is very helpful. You can use the site like it is, or go through it and kind of make a smaller selection model for yourself. Now, once you've kind of talked through your teams, you figured out what everyone values and what kind of things they feel are important to need to be created, you need to start thinking about your design system team model. Who's going to be responsible for creating the design system, building it, maybe managing it? One thing that's really important is this model is really important for sustaining your design system long term. Depending on the size of your team or the project, you might have some different approaches that you can leverage. With designers being able to code and even some developers being able to design, the makeup of the team might be a little bit different for everyone. One team model is sort of the overlord method. The overlord method is the easiest version of a design system team to roll out. They may be an independent product team or the lead product team that is building out maybe a design system, and everyone else is using that. So marketing might be using that, another product team might be using that, the internal app team might be using that as well. Puts a lot of dependency on maybe a single designer or a single designer and developer combination or a smaller team. This might be where we want to start with the design team for our product, but as the product grows and it might start to spin off into multiple products, this is the hardest one to scale because it puts a lot of pressure on that one team. The second team style is a single team. So this is sort of like a single team or a centralized team, a team of designers and developers to manage the system, and that's their sole focus. They don't have to worry about anything else besides managing that design system. They might have their own process and their own way to iterate through the work that's independent of the product teams. This can really help serve the product teams because that's their sole focus, is making sure that the product team gets what they need. The downside of a centralized or a single team is they may not feel like they're contributing to the overall product. They may feel sort of out of the loop with features or challenges that might be coming up in the different product teams. The team also might feel like they have to ask for features from the design system team. So there might be a little bit of a request system that needs to be involved here. The last model is a federated team. This model is almost like a design by committee in a way. The idea is that each product team is able to bring to the table as a group, or bring to the table as a group, whether items go into the system or not. This will not only gain a deeper buy-in from different teams and products, but it also can involve more disciplines throughout the team since the commitment isn't as dedicated. With a federated design system team, one of the most important factors will be communication, especially communicating changes, since not everyone will be heads down in the system all the time. There'll have to be a structure built around your system to help sort of promote components or promote elements or promote design patterns to the system, and that'll be communicated out to everyone. If you're ever looking to dive deeper into team models, Nathan Curtis has a really great blog post from a few years ago that goes over a couple of other team models as well. But these are three that we felt kind of scaled or were kind of fit all the different product sizes that usually we have dealt with. But we have his blog post linked at the end, and we'll send it out as well. So once we've decided to build our system, we've talked with our team, we might want to get into the creation process right away and start getting into our tools and start building up maybe a live coded system. At this point, it's a good time to take a step back, review sort of what we found that was valuable, how we did plan to manage our design system team, and start thinking about our process for building out the system. Using tools like Jira, Clubhouse, Trello, or some sort of project management tool, and setting up an end-to-end pipeline for components is a really good idea for the long-term scalability of your system and to really help in the iterating and maintaining aspects of your system. So setting this process up now will help us define success or find success later on in the process. We break it up into a couple of areas, right? We've got what we call the first section is discovery and design. This is where we're getting real creative and exploring, and we're kind of figuring out what sort of look and feel, might be doing some mood boarding, and we're starting to really set up those fundamental components. Design, we're getting a little bit more serious. Here we're starting to build up components. We're starting to commit some things that we think are the way they're going to be. This is mostly just designers at this stage. We haven't maybe brought it out to any stakeholders for approval or anything yet. Right in this example here, we're getting pretty nuanced in how focused we are, right? So we have really small components. We might have input selectors or input navigation tabs or a specific card style. You don't have to be that nuanced in this process. You might be a little higher level if you want to, but we'll talk about atomic design in a little bit, and we'll kind of see why we're this nuanced. The next stage is sort of approval and development. So we're getting component and pattern sign off. This is when we're working with developers to start building out those live versions. So once the design gets approved, we're ready to go. We'll work with the development team to build out those components. So sitting side by side maybe with them, or having them jump into the tool. If Figma, they might come in with us, and we'll kind of go through and show them how it should be built. We might be building out some of the front end components ourselves, but this is where we would get that sign off and then actually build out development. Then the most important step at the very end is documentation. So documentation, we want to spend time with our developers to work on that documentation as well. Depending on how you want, where you're documenting things, we want to make sure things are consistent, really easy to find. We want to make sure that in our documentation, it's also a way for us to go back and review some of the choices that we made and why we might have made those choices. It gets really important when we're documenting patterns over these individual components, but making sure we have access to that in our design tool, in the live coded system, or a shared repository is really, really important. And we'll go through some tools that we've used for documenting. Like I said before, this is kind of the process that we see. How you decide to break up this process is really up to you. You can break it down sections of components. It doesn't have to be individual components like this. Now you might be tackling your system without development. This might be something that you as a designer on a product or part of a design team is doing on your own, and development's not involved with it yet. It's still really good to get in a cadence of doing a process like this, because here you'll be, at some point, developers will be getting involved and a similar process like this will happen. Another thing that you might add on to in here is a QA phase, right? So at some point you might be doing some design QA or design system QA in the live coded system. So QA phase might happen usually before documentation for us. All right, so now we're gonna talk about setting up our system, right? When we first get into the design tool, there's some helpful things we can do when we're setting up our files from the get-go. We'll be using Figma for the most part to talk about, or the examples that we have. This should work in Sketch, also work in Adobe XD, InVision Studio, really any tool. This is just a way to start organizing things when we're working with a team of designers. Now, we're going to assume that we're starting from scratch. However, this can be applied to a UI kit or a design that already is live that we're turning into a design system. But this will require a little extra work and management, since moving components, at least in Figma, between files doesn't always work that well. Also, going through and renaming everything is going to take a little bit of work and effort. At Headway, we're really big believers in atomic design. When establishing our design system, we try to think of this approach of atoms, molecules, organisms, and templates. This is something that Brad Frost's book on atomic design goes over really extensively, and I highly recommend everyone read it. This will help us build out our design system to be much more, have multiple levels of inheritance in it, so changes get propagated through the entire system from these really high up the chain, and we'll kind of go show how that happens in a couple of slides. So really what we're going to do is, this is the too long won't read version of atomic design here. So when we start to build out our system, we think of things in the smallest components, right? So here we have color and type. This is what we're just calling primary color. This might be a level before atoms, but atoms are usually your second or your smallest component. So here we're going to just build out a button, right? So we've got our primary color. That primary color might also be used as a design token in our live coded system. So we could even read that color as we change it in the live coded system, and it could change there. In our UI kit, that'll drive the color of our buttons here. Our buttons are really constructed through a couple of templated pieces. We have our button plates, some text styles, and then those would build out our button templates. The next level would be molecules, and those molecules would build out the different states of our buttons. Here we might have enabled, hovered, disabled, and a loading button state, right? So we have our atoms, we have our molecules. And then lastly, we would have an organism. So this is a universal modal template that we might use. Our buttons are in here as a pattern in this organism that we can drop and reuse this anywhere we want to. So that's sort of short version of atomic design. Another layer above organisms would be templates, and these might be full screen designs or full screen templates that you can use. Or even a modal like this might be a template depending on how you're building things. We use atomic design really to build out most of our core UI kit. Our core UI kit for every project or every design system, we use it to house things that belong to all the products. This is really helpful in keeping things that span multiple products in a single place. So making sure that everyone's using the most fundamental core components on every single product that may belong to a single design system. Then we also spin up smaller design files for product specific patterns. So we might not keep, let's say we have a navigation that's specific to our mobile experience, but it's not in the web. We might not keep that in this core UI kit file. We might break it up into another layer. This is sort of a concept that we call multi-tiered UI kits. So this is kind of a diagram of an example UI kit that we may build on a larger project. This is one of the first considerations we have to make when we're working on different projects is how big is the project that we're working on. Figma actually has a 2 GB file limit. So if you exceed 2 GB, you're basically can't do anything. And so that's one of the reasons we started looking at this. Also, we wanted to have a much finer control on our system. So here, we actually went one layer deeper than atomic design and created a thing called particles. And that might be up at the very top where you can see colors, shadow, type styles. We might also have one that's called brand assets. So that might be photography, avatars, logos. Another one that might be an icon library that we're using. Then our core UI kit, which you saw sort of an example for, would ingest all of those. And there we would build out things like input fields, buttons, selectors, stuff like that. And then we would have smaller UI kit files that might be mobile specific with responsive web if we're doing like a TV app, auto. And then at the in the sort of darker purple, that would be our actual mobile product design file. That would be where we're building out those specific product designs. Which seems like a lot of steps, but if you've got a really big project that has a lot of different components to it, it really doesn't, it's really not that bad, and it helps you keep a lot of control going through, and that's why the documentation becomes really important. Then down at the very lowest level, we would bring mostly the prototypes into their own files because that's what we're sharing with our customers. That's what we're sharing with stakeholders, and that's where we're having sort of those conversations about what needs to change and what needs to be edited. And then most of our design, which sometimes can get a little messy, lives up in that higher level. This, at least in Figma, this is leveraged using linked libraries. Sketch has something similar. Adobe XD has something similar. InVision Studio, think has something similar as well. This allows us to have separate places for all our core design system files, or even different product and feature specific elements, and allows us to easily version out those files. And we'll kind of go in the next talk, we'll talk a little bit how we version things out with this system. This way, our project is really structured, and we can create the appropriate inheritance that we want, or ingesting those other components into the files that we need. Another thing that we do is think about numerically indexing our files. Our systems get pretty big, especially when we're working on enterprise apps. When we're setting up our files, numerically indexing them, this allows us to sort alphabetically and easily find out what you're looking for. This is also helpful to maybe do inside your design files as well. So we call it a double entry index. So we only have 2 sets of values. You could have 3 if you really, really needed to. The first 2 are our primary index. So we may group things like the design system files there. And the secondary index might be secondary elements in that design system grouping. And then we have an example coming up here. So just kind of showing how this may work. Normally when organizing a larger project, it may look like this, right? We've got color and type, data product, data viz library, design system core, email product, icon library, product prototype. These might be all our files living in sort of a project. Blue would be design system files. Sort of the pink ones would be sort of product design files, and our prototype would be a white one, the white file there. When we sort alphabetically, this is how they're going to sort, which may be fine. Also, if we sort by recent, they might kind of sort a little bit chaotically. What's the last one I looked at? If you numerically index them though and sort alphabetically, this is how they're going to sort. You can kind of keep all your design system files together. You can keep your product design files together. You can keep your prototypes together. We tend to stick with this one. This, along with cover images, helps really make everything super digestible and easy to find, and can help you easily reference indexes back and forth in your documentation. This can also be done in Pages as well. So this is a snapshot of what would be inside one of our core UI kit files. First page is the cover, then atoms, molecules, organisms, and templates. You can do this in the Pages, and also if you're using frames as a folder for components, you can do this in the frames as well. And this will just help when you're going to add a component from your design library in Figma. It just helps keep it really clean and really easy to go find those things. Next thing is naming conventions, right? So we talked about our numerically indexing our files, but now we need to actually start naming our components. We are big fans of BEM. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. This is a CSS / SAS naming convention developed for large scale products. This naming convention can be adapted to our components in Figma and our live coded systems. We have 3 examples here. Each one of these will show in your component tree differently. It's important to sit down and talk with your design team and even your development team on what naming convention works for you and what works for them, and find a good compromise. One thing to don't forget is in Figma and in Sketch, I think in Sketch, I know for sure in Figma, you can use frames as sort of the outermost level of your sort of folder when you're naming things. So example 1, this is a way we've sort of converted BEM to sort of in Figma naming, right? So our frame that's holding all of our buttons might be called inputs, and then our buttons might be called button state inactive. So this is a pretty simple naming convention, but is a lot closer to a traditional, the way you may name something in CSS. Example 2, we've extracted out a little bit more. So our frame might be called inputs, then our button name might be buttons / container state inactive. We're adding an extra definition in there, or it's a container style button, it's a state of inactive. So just getting a little bit more abstracted out. Still nice when you're looking through the tree, you'll still find those container state inactive under buttons. And when you look into sort of Figma has a shorthand menu on the side when you just want to replace the component, you might have that higher level of sorting in there, not getting as nuanced as you might in this next example here. So this example, same thing, we might have a frame called inputs, and then the name of the button might be buttons container and then / inactive. This one's nice. In the shorthand menu, you're just gonna have the different states of your buttons in there. But it does get a little bit lost if you want to switch out container to, like, let's say a text-based button, then you might have to go up a level and have to go find it all the way up the tree. Not that any one of these is a silver bullet to naming conventions, but just to give some ideas of what of how you can start to name things and just building out that structure when you're going through and naming your things in your files. So moving beyond static or moving outside of Figma or Sketch, there's some really great tools that allow live design systems to be viewed by stakeholders and the design team. Using these tools will help in our ability to not only QA the design system and components before it's live and on pages, and we can sort of see how it's acting and help with that QA process. One tool that is really, really nice is Storybook. Storybook's a way for the front-end team or even us as designers to build out actual components in a space where they can be easily viewed. You can even live embed your Figma frames into Storybook, so developers can see the components and any notes right from Figma. We actually have a talk that we did on this along with a React.js group that we'll link up afterwards to kind of show an example of that. But Storybook, I definitely recommend using it. You don't have to build out a whole custom domained site for your design, live coded design system. You can use something like Storybook, and it's got some really good examples. Another tool that can live embed your designs from your design tool and can even ingest Storybook into it is ZeroHeight. ZeroHeight also supports just raw HTML and CSS for your live coded design system. ZeroHeight also provides an entire documentation system built inside of it. So this is really good for large scale teams. Lots of people need to be in the design system, maybe reviewing different sort of documentation about patterns and stuff like that. This is a really, really good tool. There is a cost associated to ZeroHeight, so it might not make sense for everybody, but it is, it's a really, really nice tool. One thing that we've used a lot is Notion. Notion is another tool that you can manage your design system in. You can use live embed from Figma. You can't, at least not that I'm aware of, you can't put any HTML or CSS or any front end code into it, but you can still do a lot of documentation in here. And now Figma allows external links from the tool to go to external pages in the view element, not just prototypes. So you can actually link back to your Notion documentation as well. And lastly, you can always document right in Figma as well, right? So we built out a bunch of components for our design systems. We call it sort of like a design system management system, and it's a way for us to leave documentation right inside of Figma. So when developers or other designers are looking into Figma, they can see the documentation right in there. We don't like to use the comments. We try to use the comments for more things to need to be done. Using Figma for that documentation and notation is really helpful. And like I said before, now you can actually put links right into that text there if you need to leap out to some external documentation as well. So that's kind of it for that's kind of everything in the creation process. So these are the sort of what I call like the toolbox. So these are some of the tools that we talked about. The design system checklist that is super helpful when planning out your design system. Shipwright is a UI kit that we developed that is on the Figma community that you can download. So you can kind of get an idea and see how we actually do that. And it'll be continually evolving as we learn new things and as we get inspired by new processes. A link to Storybook, ZeroHeight, Notion, just great documentation tools for when you're getting your system up off the ground. Some other good resources is Envision put out a design systems handbook, which is a really good read, something I definitely recommend reading through if it's the first time tackling a system. Some resources is for the BEM naming, there's a little BEM cheat sheet. If you're doing some front end stuff, that BEM cheat sheet is definitely helpful. And something to look at as designers, even if you never end up doing any front end stuff, just to see how somebody may be naming things in the live coded world that you could bring back into your design system, your more static design system. And then team models for scaling design system is that Nathan Curtis blog post. Nathan Curtis actually has a lot of really good blog posts and that has inspired a lot of our processes. Definitely check out some of the stuff he's written. We've got a blog post on a little bit more detail on multi-tiered UI kits for design systems. And definitely Brad Frost's Atomic Design book will help a lot. And with the way the tools are now, it's more applicable now than it ever has been. All right, well, thank you everyone for hanging out and going through this.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. Billy, we'll just kind of take it from the top back to the start from Aman. What do you mean by small project and big project? I want to know when I should start to think about design systems.
Hey, before you jump in, Billy, you can stop sharing your screen probably, just so as people are talking, you can see faces and stuff. There we go. Thank you.
So a small project might be, so if we're early on and we're doing sort of a product validation and we might be building up a small prototype test that we want to validate if an idea is even worth pursuing further, that might be a small enough project that we may not be building a design system for. However, if we're building, let's say, a mobile app that has, I don't know, let's just say a dozen or more screens, and it might need a marketing site that gets spun up with it, that would still be a small project. That's where we probably want to start thinking about building our design system. If you're looking at like enterprise style software where it's multiple products, multiple apps, living off of a single design system, along with marketing sites, internal collateral, all of that, that's definitely, you want to have that conversation as soon as possible, because it's going to save you so much work in the end.
Yeah, so we'll go to the next one. I think in that maybe just a quick point is like it's super easy to, even if you have a design library designated inside of Figma, to create a button and then pull that in and reuse it. So like I found it really useful even as we're validating products to create a component even as a holder, even if you're not fleshing out a complex system, and then be able to iterate quick once you make design decisions. So even if it's super lightweight, using just the normal components and then evolving that into a design system, or pivoting it into something like Shipwright has been helpful.
And with auto layout, it has gotten even more flexible, and it saves you so much more time. If you can, auto layout can be a little tricky, but it can really be really dynamic, building out mobile and web and responsive web elements all with a single element. You can get real creative with it.
Yeah, so next question from Stephen Giang. Sorry if I'm sorry if I'm butchering the last name there. What are some things you do to promote usage and acceptance of the design system components with designers and engineers too?
So one of the things that, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get into maintaining and iterating, is setting up sort of with your engineers, setting up a monthly, maybe weekly, or every 2 weeks, a design system audit and review to sort of create those backlog issues, get those things logged, making sure that it's continually being brought to the forefront. That'll help build out that sort of trust. Also, in the beginning of a project, working with your engineers and development or developers to build out those storybook components. We use Storybook on a lot of projects, and that will help us in the beginning to sort of get that buy-in, because we're doing a little bit of QA on that stuff early, so they can really solve the harder problems later on down the road. As for a design team, it can be difficult, especially if it's a team that hasn't worked in a design system before, or they're just not used to it. So I think introducing it early, small elements at a time, kind of slowly. We're not going to come in and build this monolithic system and everyone's going to immediately buy in, but just kind of continually be the champion in there, and just really small, slow and steady. And everyone will eventually, once they can see how easy it is and the benefits of how much time it saves them, they can definitely start to convert some of those holdouts.
Yeah, Steven's got a few other questions here. We'll just bounce around and come back to those. So we'll still get to those. From Andrew Hooker from our dev team, how do you factor in the buildability of component before developers are involved? I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit, but.
Yeah, so one thing that we're trying to do a little bit more often now is get developers into the conversation a little bit earlier than we normally would. So maybe not at a component level, but maybe at a pattern, or let's say we're building out a data visualization library. We might sit with the developers, work through what might be a library that they want to use ahead of time, so we can use that as inspiration for how we're going to style and customize and do what we need to do for that. So trying to have that conversation earlier, because from our experience, if you don't have that conversation, either it won't get followed, there won't be enough time to follow it, or the buy-in's not there. So just trying to continually be the best, I don't know, be your developer's best friend as much as possible, and try to make it easier for them.
The next one from Alak Kumar. Have observed that a lot of times PM and product owners become creative after the wireframes presented. Looking at the wireframe, they want to add more features to improve the product. What process is required to be introduced to make sure we have less iteration during a prototype and wireframe phase?
So if we're going through if we get approval on sort of wireframe and we say this wireframe is locked, we've been using, we'll link it up, but we've been using a plugin now to manage sort of the status of frames in Figma. And we sort of communicate that this has been approved, we're moving forward to styling, we're moving forward with the design, the wireframes are sort of locked. And we try to be a little bit more rigid around that process. So much so that if something does go back into review, we may spin up another version of that if they want to get and make some changes into a new file. And if development is already working on one, that other one may be coming up afterwards. But just trying to show the consequences of those changes in sort of the files and communicating the status as much as possible is one way we've helped. I wouldn't say stop it, but at least manage it a little bit better. And so that's just been really helpful, is like status in the files, so you can see where everything's at. If the changes are a lot, spinning up maybe even a new file to say, hey, this is V2, we don't have time for it now, but we can get to it later on. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, next question here, back to Stephen. How do you create a point of truth so that design system is parallel or even one and the same between design and engineering? You talked about that a little bit, but maybe there might be a little bit of color you could add to that.
Yeah, so that's where sort of either every 2 weeks or every month having sort of that conversation with the developers, having that meeting, sitting down and going through the live coded system, going through what's changed in sort of your design tool, the documentation will help a ton. Making sure that communication cycle just doesn't break down, and making sure that meeting happens will help. Getting into working with that sort of the team that'll be a part of that early will help a lot as well. It's going to get out of sync because it just naturally happens, but you can continually just sort of pull things back in and keep that process going with your development, or even other designers, because there are times where sometimes things will get out of sync when other designers are working on a different product and maybe in your sort of in that federated model. So having sort of that approval process, having those check-ins will help communicate to everyone what's changing, what needs to go live. And then for us, a lot of times it's designers maybe writing up some of the some of the bugs or the tickets or the feature requests of the dev team to communicate those changes as well.
Yeah, one thing that we've seen on like the bigger teams that we've been working with as we have more people is design systems lead. And if you're at a big team already, you likely have this person on your staff, or maybe someone that's focusing a lot of their time, to bridge the gap between the designers and the design system and design operations and how that works into the dev team, working with the front end team. And that might be a lot more frequent. That's kind of like that overlord model that Billy shared, where you have a single source who's really working on design system day in and day out and making sure design has what they need, engineering has what they need, and all that good stuff. Next one here from Nicholas Botero. How do you convince stakeholders that a design system is worth the time and investment?
At the beginning, I can see the resistance from stakeholders of not seeing why they would want to invest in that. However, like towards the end of the project, you can really start to see on how quickly you can change and iterate and mock new things up and get things, and just the reusability-ness, I don't know if that's a word, of the system really just becomes a tenfold improvement of doing everything from scratch. I think like a lot of it comes down to having that conversation with them early. Maybe it's not a full system that is fully comprehensive, but maybe it starts small, start to get some small wins and small victories. So we start to build that credibility with the stakeholders, and they can start to see the benefits of that system. I think the smallest way, at least for designers, is just building out your own core design system UI kit in your design tool, and start continually using it in conversation of every time you're at a stakeholder meeting, be like, yeah, we got this done in this time because we built out this design system, because we invested in this. And I think those small victories will definitely change the way they might think about it.
Yeah, that's good. Next one here, a little bit more tactical, from Caroline. Hugh, sorry. Do you have to turn icons into components?
Do you have to turn icons into components? I'm a big fan of icons being components as their own components, just because if they change, then we've already got them nested throughout the entire system. One thing on a recent project, I wish I would have done earlier is pulled the icon library out from the core UI kit, so that if we got a new icon library, I can easily just swap them all out. But yes, I like keeping all my icons as components.
Here from anonymous attendee, we have, how do you grow your career path to end up focusing on design systems? And part two, if you do end up working most of responsibility on design systems and spend less time working on actual screen designs, how do you position yourself?
I think it's depending on where you're at, right? So I think a lot of it is sort of being that champion and starting to implement it as much as you can, or as much as your timeline, your scope, and your budget allows, will help you bring design systems into whatever organization you're at. So starting to be that champion, starting to bring it up small, and working in there. I think like that'll be the best way to start to morph that, because then stakeholders will start to see the benefit of that and the improvements in the process. As for, what was the second half of the question?
It was, if you're focusing mostly on design systems, how do you, sorry, I disabled it. Yeah, I already archived it. How do you, like, how would you recommend positioning yourself? I think was essentially it. So if you're just focusing on design systems, like in a lead role, like how do you present to companies and that sort of thing?
So I think like, even if you're solely focused on design systems, I think you're still going to be involved maybe at a higher level in a lot of the screen design, and some of you might not be so much in the iteration and research and maybe user interview aspects of design, but you'll still be involved in screen design and still be allowed to give input and still be there, because if you're in charge of the design system, you're going to be constantly trying to recommend maybe a pattern you've already built, or a way, or seeing what designers are bringing to you, and how can you implement that into a system that could be your into your system as a reusable element.
Next question from Ray Sessenbach. I don't know if you remember him, Billy. I think we both met him at Monteuse Epicurrence. Hey, Ray, thanks for joining. Any experience or thoughts on using Envision DSM's tool for system documentation?
Outside of the initial, when they first launched it and checking it out, we used it just for really just to experiment in it. I think whatever works for you as a documentation tool, like I said, we are solely in Figma and using Figma for everything. So we've built out some elements in Figma so we could do documentation in Figma along with Notion. We've experimented with zero height. We're leveraging Storybook a lot more. So I think, like, as long as you have a place that is accessible for everyone to see that documentation, and it's going to be well maintained, I think any tool can be good. We just haven't had a lot of experience with Envision.
Yeah, I would say my experience with the DSM tool has been, like, if you're in a largely compliant industry like healthcare, financial tech, logistics, supply chain even, and you rely on a tech team to approve changes, we've seen a lot of kind of collisions between Sketch, Envision DSM, or Sketch and Abstract. As versions become out of sync, you have to continually put in requests to upgrade. And if you're a part of a team, you probably know what that looks like. So we've seen a lot of teams move over to Figma from that, so that as the program updates, it's all web-based and they don't have to put in support requests, which sometimes if you're, the design system lead, right, on a project and you can't access it because you have to wait a day until your tool updates, that it's going to hurt you, it's going to hurt the product team. But just one benefit we've seen with highly compliant clients. The next part of that by Ray that we can tackle now is just what type of documentation are you writing per component? Is there a certain outline you use to ensure devs understand how and when to use different design patterns?
Yeah, so it really depends. We're trying to get away from the old, we're trying to train a lot of the developers to see how to break down and actually use the tools in Figma. So we're getting away from like redlining as much as possible and not getting too nuanced about that. If we can, we want to be sitting with them during the maybe Storybook or early on process to help resolve a lot of those issues. Depending on how our project rolls out, a lot of times we might be just listing out sort of feature or how things need to work, where things need to, if we don't have time to do animations or we don't have time to hook up certain prototypes, we might be listing out just a bunch of this is how this element needs to work, this is the different states this has. Sometimes we might even be putting in some of the data into the documentation as well. So like, let's say if we have a data table, here's where the values are, here where they might come from, because we've found that out in the discovery. So our documentation really can span different levels. It depends on sort of what our team makeup is, what is sort of your role and time and effort as a designer on that team. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. We're, like I said, we're just trying to get out of the redlining stuff. So Figma in the view allows developers to sort of see the padding, see all that stuff. So we can try to get away from that as much as possible and spend more time just communicating sort of meaningful components. We also try to go through prototypes a lot with the developers, and we've even started to record using Loom, do some walkthrough recordings to watch different elements in the prototype, because if we need to make sort of like a super animated prototype that may not be in the one that we're showing to a stakeholder because we're just showing how something works, we might do that and then nest that into like a Notion document.
We've got a couple questions in the chat we'll tackle here, and then we'll bounce back to the questions. But for a startup, do you recommend building from scratch or using Ant design system, which I don't know if you remember seeing that Ant design system, but or any design system could be that too.
I think it's really up to you, like looking at the time and effort you have, or just really time available and the resources you have available. We early on used a lot of UI kits and modified them to our own needs because a lot of stuff was there already. And then we started building out our own because we wanted to build things a little bit differently, things to be a little bit more lightweight. Like I said, on some enterprise projects, we ran into file limitations. So we started need to implement little tips and tricks that we need to do. For example, hitting the eyeball icon to turn a layer off in a file doesn't actually remove that element from memory. It still sucks up memory. So having things like a blank, empty component that can be dropped everywhere. So like weird nuanced things like that. I think like downloading a kit to start off with and use is great. It helps you get a certain length of the way. It has a bunch of components that are already there. What I would probably do is get rid of the stuff that you're not using, just so it's not so overloaded right off the bat, to keep it kind of small and concise, modify it to fit your needs and then go with it. But also, I would say if it's your first time building one in a design tool, definitely download some of the kits that are out there and take a look at them. We just put a V1 of ours out there. There's a bunch of good ones on the Figma community. Take a look at them, see how people are building them, because just because it works for us, it might not necessarily work for you, or you might find something that is much better for your team and just how to build it. You might uncover some really good secrets in there. I forget which kit we downloaded, but the thing that basically inspired us to put emojis in almost all of the layer names and stuff like that was off of a UI kit that we downloaded, and they just had that in their layer names. So you learn a lot from just kind of looking through them. Oh, also another thing with UI kits, if your team is working in a front-end library like Material UI or something like that, if there is a UI kit from that available, to use as a starting point, that'll be helpful too, because it'll save you a ton of time doing the research and all the documentation to figure everything out, because all the states and everything will be there. So.
Yeah, there's another question here. Are any components from your design systems reused for new projects? How often are they reused from libraries, or should there be a new design system made for each one? Grid, color palette, radius, etc.
Yeah, so that's why we started building out Shipwright, which is our UI kit. Is we wanted to have a boilerplate that we could start when we spin up a new project. So then they may all start the same, but at the end they're all pretty wild. They're pretty different depending on the project needs. So what we'll do is, like I said, that's our starting point. We're continually adding to it as we start to build out new things or get new ideas of how the system should work. But yeah, I would say you can always start from a similar part. You might build something really cool in one system, and then you're going to rebuild that in your boilerplate the same way a development team might have like a starter app that they might use for something.
Yeah, I think it goes back to being able to, I guess, like use, being able to use the same components, because a button at the end of the day is a button. And if you change the color of the button and the text, like it looks different, it starts to feel like a different app. Same thing with the typography. So we found, that starting point is really helpful, because you don't have to do all the work that nobody wants to do, which is connecting all of these up, setting up auto layout, setting up the scaling rules. And then, you really start focusing more on prototyping, validation, and the business facing problems, rather than, just recreating the kit. Another question here from Greg. How would a team tackle building, or how should a team tackle building, managing a design system where everyone's working completely remote and in different time zones?
So that's funny, because our whole team is basically, our whole design team is remote, except for Sam, Andrew, and myself before the quarantine. So it's really communication is the key, setting up that process ahead of time. So getting either one meeting on the books in the beginning to find out the things that people find valuable, the things that they really maybe attach to, and sort of rolling out who's in charge of what. We actually, when we started the Shipwright UI kit, we actually had different people who were in charge of building different things at first, and it worked really well. And we were able to bring that all together into the UI kit. And then, so I think just like putting out that good process, having a good communication pipeline, either in if you are working asynchronously because of time zones and everything like that, I think leveraging Figma comments, leveraging either like a project management tool like Trello. We were using Trello at the time when we had people working on different elements. So we would go through and we say, all right, you're on inputs, you might be on selectors, you might be on buttons, you're on avatars. Here's what we think. We had a meeting, we distilled it down as a team. Some people weren't able there, but we were able to still distill everything down. And then everyone just kind of worked on it and we kind of iterated it together as a group, mostly asynchronously because people would have their different, for different free times to work on it throughout the week that we couldn't all meet up at the same time. So yeah, I think just getting that good process and at least getting that initial kickoff with everyone to have that conversation, and using something like design system checklist will be super helpful to at least distill out what you may want other designers to work on.
Good. Another question, or a question here from Shivani. Do you have suggestions for a good standalone resource for learning the best practices for building and structuring component design systems and styles in Figma? Looking for something that's fully up to date, ideally a single tutorial link that's free and easy to follow with step-by-step examples.
I don't have one off the top of my head. I know there are a couple of, at least MDS is somebody who I've followed and watched. He's put out a lot of good videos. Joel Buchelman's put out some good videos, but it was in Sketch about a year ago. Yeah, I can't think of one that's like end to end right off the top.
Yeah, can't think of anything that's up to date, especially because Figma moves so quick, which is great. I think that's a big big benefit to having things in a componentized design system, is that you can roll out new changes to the system fairly quick as things are componentized. All right, next question here from Joel Brown. Do you have any advice for an experienced designer who's used to having things refined and organized, who's been thrown into a massive multi-platform product with a subpar UX, UI consistency, and pretty unorganized structure of design libraries? So basically, how do you create some clarity in that chaos from a design system perspective?
I think a lot of it comes back to finding that small area or that small corner where you can start and start to leverage, maybe you got to do a UX audit, see everything that's in there, see where everything is documentation wise, all the different components, and start to figure out where is a small area that you can start to leverage out that system. Build out that single navigation pattern that can be reused across multiple products, or build out a couple of things that can be dropped into even just a couple of products, or even one, just to start building that habit and that process. And then as you're working along, you'll start to get some of those other designers involved with it as well, and turn them into sort of champions of a design system as well. I know, like, when you're jumping into a product that's already in process and in flight, and the process has been defined either structurally or organically, it can be hard to do that. But I still find, like, if you start real small and start building it up, you can start to win people over, show them the benefits of using it. And sometimes other designers might just not know. They might not know the power or how useful it is. So just having a little bit of time to get in a Zoom, show them this is the benefit, here's how we can use this, here's how we can reuse these components. I understand sometimes there's a fear in designers is like, you've put me into a box now because I have to use these. But having sort of a system that allows things to be promoted to the system and out of it, and just communicating that with them should help alleviate any of those fears or concerns.
I think that goes into Jonathan's question here. I'm a CSS developer and I'm leading my company's design system efforts. I found it very hard to convince designers and stakeholders to focus on components, atoms, tokens, and responsive scale flows instead of page-based or platform-based design and prototypes. Any advice on how to process this? How can I start small and make progress?
Yeah, I think yeah, on the front end side of it, I think one of the things like we started to do on some of our projects is build out that storybook library and and then get the designers involved in that process, and have them start thinking about, hey, if we set up this pattern now, we don't have to worry about it all the way down in the end when we're looking at a screen and things don't look right, because we've already spent the time to do that now. And I think building out that process with either one designer would help get it going there. I understand sometimes though that like it is a lot harder when you're trying to bring design system thinking over to the design team, because it can be, there can be resistance there. So I think like working with the design team to maybe help, I don't know if you've got issues with QAing full screens where things aren't matching what they think, and just talking with them. We've had developers who've identified patterns that, you know, we didn't even see sometimes building out a system, and just getting them involved in the process, or if they're the ones creating the process, getting design involved in that process of like, hey, here's the pattern we see. How can we make this reusable? How can we make this responsive and be a component that we can leverage instead of something new that needs to be created every time? Hopefully, you're in a process where when screens are presented to you, it's not like they're done and there is no more iteration on it. We've had situations like that. We're trying to get developers and front end involved earlier in the process, so we can help to think about things as components, because a lot of times if your system gets really big, there's times that you can forget something that you've already made, and you might propose a new idea, and then sometimes you know, your developer will go, hey, we've already built something similar to this. Can we just use this? And you're like, oh yeah, we totally can. So I think just getting them involved into it as much as possible, and then hopefully you can get into the conversation earlier with designers, and you're not just getting those final specs.
Yeah, I think the prototypes, the page-based, the mobile, you know, platform-based, and prototypes will go a lot better, a lot faster, a lot smoother with a design system in place. You know, for us, like for example, as we set up prototypes and do user interviews, let's say it's a customer solution interview where we're showing them a prototype, we can come back tomorrow and have changes across an entire flow because it's componentized, versus in the past, you know, if we didn't use, even if we were just using regular components, it might be a few days to a week before we could get back to those interviews. So really reducing the feedback cycle, and obviously the benefit is hand off to developer experience is a lot better because the components are designed and the patterns are defined out. That's good. Going into Jamie Chang's question, you mentioned a little bit about responsiveness, Billy. What's our approach to including responsiveness into the design system?
So like I said before, we think of it as multi-tiered. What we'll do is we'll pick normally a couple of breakpoints. Let's say we're working a responsive web, right? So we'll have our core UI kit, which is most of our raw components, buttons, inputs, selectors, and then we'll spin up maybe a responsive web UI kit that might be underneath it. And in that responsive web, we will start to maybe build out some templated, let's say we're working on navigation, we might have some templated navigation using auto layout. Now responsive has become really easy. If we need to, we may build up a different version of that menu, but we'll select a couple of key breakpoints depending on the project size, scale and scope, that we might build out maybe different components for those responsive breakpoints if we need to. With auto layout now, which is probably the last month or two, that kind of has changed a few things, because if you're doing, let's say, a block-based approach, you can actually set auto layout in any frame, and you can just remove something out, and it'll just auto, as it says, auto lay it out, sort of back to normal. So that might change the way we think about it, but we may do that. So like pick out those key breakpoints, build out components only if we need to fit those. Most of the stuff in Figma, even before auto layout, using the scaling and constraints worked really well for most of the responsive things that we needed. Also really leveraging type styles. So now with auto layout, type styles have actually even become more powerful. So if you have different, let's say you're changing your the size of your type based on the screen size or those breakpoints, auto layout will kind of just handle that a lot better now than it used to. So that's a lot more powerful as well. But then if we're going to build out, like, let's say that's our responsive web, but then we have a mobile app, that might be its own UI kit or its own design system for mobile specific things, just because we want to think of it just a little bit different and stick to those mobile patterns over here. And we might not be leveraging a whole lot out of the responsive web. Anything that is leveraged in both, we might promote up to that core UI kit. So hopefully that helps a little bit with dealing some of multi-products or multi-device and different responsiveness.
Yeah, Kwani, can you just type in the chat here if that helped solve your question as well on monitor resolution? If not, we can come back to that one. The next question here by Kevin McDonald. I run into situations with Figma where I have to detach a component at times in order for it to make it work realistically in the prototype, especially with larger organisms. Are there cases where you detach something from a component? If so, how do you handle it?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons we may have that lowest level prototype file, because sometimes you may need to detach something or bring something in. For example, doing hover states for a table, right? We might have a table that is our full component, but then we'll have a bunch of extra rows just floating down underneath. So we have those nice hover states in our prototype. Or we might have sometimes an input drop-down selector in our organism, and then we'll be using an overlay state in the prototype to bring up that drop-down, and that's another component that is off to the side that's set up appropriately. So sometimes in the prototype file, we might have things maybe not necessarily broken apart. Sometimes we'll have to, depending on how the prototype works or the animation that we're doing in there. But that's why it's nice to have that prototype file. And hopefully, if it's something that we broke apart because we needed it to look or function differently, sort of outside of the prototype, but sort of like we're doing like a different a pattern change, we'll try to bring that back into the system if we notice that. And there's times where we've done things in the prototype and we've broken things apart and we go, oh yeah, this is totally going to benefit the system. So let's just go back and add that in. So hopefully that helped or helps.
Yeah, the next one here we have is from Anonymous. My agency uses Sketch and is not really accepting to move over to Figma. Cries. The program crashes consistently with the use of abstract when I created my last design system for security platform. Do you have any advice on how to lighten up a huge file with the / the use of symbols? What's the best time, and when do you know when to separate your UIs into different files and libraries?
Yeah, so we actually have had experience on this where we were working in Figma and we built the whole design system in a single file, and we ran into the file limit and we had to start to abstract it out from there. So totally feel your pain there. It's hard to know right off the bat, like, when should I do this? That's why there are things that we call as like sort of the low hanging fruit for abstracting out. And that is like, you know, your type styles, maybe your colors, maybe your icons, avatars, stuff like that. Those can easily be in its own file. Doesn't have to be in your core components file. But that's another a quick sort of victory is to pull out sort of those specific, like either web components or mobile components into a different file, and that file might have its own organisms and templates in it, but it's leveraging those core components from there. So those are some quick victories to mitigate sort of the file size. How that works with Sketch and Abstract, I'm unsure, because the last time we had a lot of the same problems with Abstract, just like crashing files and not being able to get the right version, or it not pulling down the right version. So that I'm not really sure. Hopefully at some point, maybe Sketch and Abstract build out sort of a live updating system that could help mitigate some of that. But yeah, when you're starting your project, like I said, those low-hanging fruits are probably the easiest quick victories to get. And then just as things start to get a little bit bigger and you start to think about the size, or you start to see it get a little bit bigger, thinking about things that you can spin out. And don't be afraid to have to rework things. If you need to, in a project that I'm on, I will take maybe like half the day on Friday, because I've created a backlog of things that either need to be migrated. We built some components one way 6 months ago, and we've got new lighter weight ones that are going to save us a ton on memory. Now I'll put a little coffin in the name and the ones that are sunsetted, and then we'll have these new ones, and I'll spend like half a day going through and replacing those out, just sort of to keep things clean and maintained. So finding those little bits of time to do that is really good. I wish I would have saved the video. We had a navigation element that had a bunch of hidden layers in it. And that navigation element was on every single screen in the entire product. And we deleted those hidden layers out of it and just built out different components. And I think we had 40,000 layers get deleted out of one file. It was insane to watch that number just tick down. So like having that time to kind of clean that stuff up is really beneficial.
All right, we just have a couple more questions here. One more from Steven from before. When do we stop benefiting from the scale of design? Is there a project too big, too small, / friction and cost too great?
I mean, I think too small, you can definitely spend too much time maybe over engineering a design system, or getting too caught up into trying to make this super clean and super effective design system, and you might not be getting sort of those quick victories that the project or the process demands. Like this may happen in, like I said, you're doing a validation phase, you're only doing a quick prototype. There's still design system thinking that can be brought to that. So like building, using components instead of just building everything out, not being componentized, which saves time, but is not necessarily like fully design systemed from the beginning. As projects get bigger, I feel personally that design systems become more and more important, because getting multiple people to work with the design system and getting multiple products rolling off of a single design system saves a lot of time and effort and energy. So I think I personally don't know of a project, we haven't worked on one that would be too big for a design system yet, even on some of our enterprise projects. But like I said, I could see small projects maybe spending too much time over engineering, but maybe still using some of that design system thinking to leverage some of the productivity benefits.
Yeah, and one last one here from Joseph Ruano. Do you recommend starting a design system with code, HTML markup first, and then adding the design, colors, fonts, etc.?
As a designer, I usually think of do it in the lowest amount of effort areas first. So that's, for me, it's Figma. So it's easy for me to start building it out there and then think about the documentation. However, if it's faster for you, we have somebody who works with us has built out things right in Webflow as building out sort of a design system in there for a project instead of spending any time in Figma or Sketch at the time. So I think whatever works best for you or is the fastest way for you to start building that out, I would do it in that space. But then hopefully if you're working with a team of designers, front-end engineers, getting that buy-in from everyone across the board.
Yeah, that sounds good. That's it for the questions. I appreciate everyone's insights and thoughts and questions into the section here. Billy, do you just want to give a quick preview of what's coming up the next 2 sessions, and maybe if there's questions that will help us make sure we're adding value to the group, that, you know, if you have any questions about those, feel free to send those in.
Yeah, for sure. So the next session or next 2 sessions, we're going to talk about iterating in our design system. We'll spend a lot of time on versioning files, how we're going to manage the state of components, and how we're going to communicate things in sort of Figma, and how we're going to work with our team on documenting. So we'll kind of go through how we document stuff and sort of the process that we do for managing even the state of screens and everything like that working in design systems. And then we'll also talk about scaling them up a little bit. How do we talk about, like I mentioned a little bit in the QA, how do we like sunset certain things and then bring out new components in, and finding that time and that rhythm to continually edit and clean and maintain, so your design system doesn't just turn into the kitchen junk drawer.
Yeah, that sounds great. Jacob, anything else from you to close this out?
No, yeah, I think this is great. I almost wonder if we should do like a bi-monthly, like just Q&A at a certain time. It reminded me that our development team is actually live on Twitch right now. We just, this is our first time ever doing Twitch. I'll throw it here in the chat. If anyone's curious, our development team's building something, I think they're building a cribbage game or something just for fun. They're live streaming it, so you can kind of eavesdrop into like how they think and how they work together, which is pretty cool. And this is obviously on YouTube Live as well, but this whole recording will be up. It'll be up probably tonight on YouTube, but I'll probably repost it tomorrow. I'll trim it a little bit, and we'll also have all the resources as best we can shared as well. And so obviously, if you registered for this event, we have your email, so we'll be following up with you this week with links to everything, so you don't have to dig for it. So we'll be in touch, and we'll let you know about future events as well. And if you have any ideas for what you'd like to learn with us, it sounds like someone reached out about asking us starting like a LinkedIn group or a Discord or Slack channel or something like that with the community. We'll definitely think about it and see what the best way of doing that would be for everybody. So yeah, this has been awesome. So thanks again, everyone, for asking all these questions and engaging and sharing on social. Like we have some folks sharing on Instagram. Thank you so much for doing that. It's very cool. Yeah, we just look forward to keep helping everyone get better at what they do. So yeah, awesome.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I think that's it. We'll be in touch, and everybody take care.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.